Today, we're going to talk about sexual shame. We're going to talk about shame generally, but particularly we're going to talk about sexual shame. This is one of my favorite topics in these works because I think it's one of the most surprising to people. I don't know what experience you all had when you first read Love and Responsibility or Theology, or read the Theology of the Body audiences, but I was shocked. You know, I'm a convert to the faith. I had all of the kind of prejudices against, Catholic teachings on love and sexuality that you sort of hear bandied about. And this stuff was a revelation, it upended so much of what I thought. And I think it still has that effect today, even for people who are sort of used to it when you get into it. And this one's always one of my favorites because, when you talk about shame, no one likes it really. So that's why it's fun to talk about. I ask people all the time, where did it go? Like, what's so good about it? And so I'll take this opportunity. This is the one time you'll get singled out for this in a favorable way. Has anyone not done the readings? Our cameraman. We have only one brave soul over here willing to admit that he has not done the readings. That's just fine. So I want to ask you, what is shame? Well, but that's precisely why I'm asking. If you've done the readings, you kind of know the answer. But I mean, if you just ask someone, man, on the street, like, what is shame? Boy, what is it? Any takers? Yes.
Wanting to hide.
Yeah, hiding.
Don't want to be seen.
Yeah, okay, hiding, not wanting to be seen. There's a sort of fear to it. Often there's a oppressive element. Yes.
In the popular imagination, it's attached to being ashamed. So it's something that you are sorry for. You don't want people to know because they would think less of you. Yeah. We want to hide these things that we are ashamed about. We are concerned with our appearance before others. All of these are bad, right? These are all sort of negative feelings, right? I think that's what we tend to associate shame with. But we find here a very different understanding of shame. These negative feelings are present in a way, but they're all oriented towards positive values, we're going to find. And so you have this common idea, right, that shame is about censorship or repression. It largely comes, I think, from Freud, who said that shame was a manifestation, a vehicle for censorship. And this is pretty much what our culture has taken up. As usual, Freud was wrong and the culture is wrong. So nothing new there. So what we're going to talk about is more of the positive aspects of shame. If you did do the readings for everyone else in Love and Responsibility, you notice right at the beginning, Wojtyła mentions Max Scheler. And we're going to spend a little bit of time actually talking about Scheler before we get into Wojtyła. If you're not familiar with Scheler, he was really very prominent in his day ethical philosopher who was also in Göttingen with Hildebrand. He was a close friend and mentor of Hildebrand's and with Edith Stein and all of these people in that circle. According to our very own Professor Crosby, who once asked the Holy Father what his favorite writing was by Scheler. He said it was actually his essay on shame, which is what we're going to talk about. John Paul II, when he was doing his dissertation, wrote that, or his habilitation on Scheler and his ethical system. So it's very influential in the thought of JP2 and in the development of the theology of the body. So that's what we're going to start with. And so Scheler, right out of the gate, says that shame, and some of these will be quotes, some of them will not. He says that shame is an expression in man of the meeting of flesh and spirit, of the animal and the divine. It's a tension between the spiritual personhood and our embodied needs. Neither animals nor angels have a capacity for shame. Animals lack the inner life that is necessary, and angels lack the embodiment that would be prerequisite for having shame. So it's a uniquely human thing, the sort of locus of man as this metaxu, the in-between here. So it's a characteristic of humankind, and it's a universal characteristic. It says all cultures have shame. It manifests in different ways, and so we have to be very careful about sort of saying, that someone or some culture is or isn't shameful or is shameless. It says even in cultures where people walk around mostly naked, they still often will cover their sexual organs. And he even gives an example of one culture where people do walk around entirely naked, and of a missionary who asked someone to cover themselves, and the woman was ashamed then to be covered, right? So there was still this sense of shame, which is a very natural feeling, even though it expresses itself in all these different ways. And a lot of people will try to reduce that down to something else, right? And say that shame is really a function of censorship, or shame is, or even this clothing of the sexual organs is a result of sort of an institutionalization of, protection and the need for warmth. I think we already have a much better, fuller account of that in the story of Genesis, right? After the apple scene, you probably remember, Adam and Eve, suddenly find themselves naked. And they're very quick to cover up. This is probably, I assume, not because their genitals suddenly got very cold. There was something else, right? They felt this disharmony between their bodies and their current state. So no, there's something deeper going on, right? There's a turn to ourselves, which is what you see there in that story. So shame always involves this turning into ourselves and awareness of our own individuality. In Watiwa, he'll develop that a little more to talk about even our interiority. So shame has this function. Shame is a reaction that is developed into a feeling, he says, right? And that is a reaction against the private becoming public. It's a protective feeling of the individual, of his or her value against the whole sphere of what is general and public. So shame will often, it's there to protect your private values, right? The inner life, the higher values. And it's important to note that there are cases where shame would not be present, like if you were, for instance, a patient at a doctor, right? Like there, your private life is not revealed in your body in the same way, right? If you are being examined by a doctor, if you are at the beach bathing, if you are a model before a painter, these are all areas where you are not present as an individual, but present as an object, but not yourself that object, right? You represent something else. So these are cases where shame would not apply. It protects the individuality of the person per se. So it has this protective function, both protecting private from public and protecting higher from lower. It's only the higher values that would need protecting in the first place. And in sexual shame, particularly, we see both of these things at work. So sexual shame is what Scheler calls, Scheler says this is manifest the tension between the sexual love and the sexual drive. I'm not going to get into all of Scheler's drives. He has a bunch of them. Ask me after if you want to. But he characterizes these two in three different ways. Love, he says, is directed towards values. It is devoted to its object. And it is the individualizing factor in sexual relations, as opposed to the sex drive, which is, instead of values, directed at feelings of sexual gratification, instead of devotion, driven to one's own pleasures. And it is the quantifying principle in sexual relations. You might think of a Don Juan. So it is when we fail to see the relation between these two that we get these repressive expressions of shame on the one hand, or shamelessness on the other hand, right? If you look only to the sexual drive and don't see its relationship with love, or if you look to love and don't see its relationship to the sexual drive. So he says these things are intimately related, and we're going to explore that a little bit. First, a couple of really choice quotes from him about this. Shame, he says, is a shell, as it were, in which love grows until it genuinely breaks this shell. Although shame is nourished by the sexual drive, it is only present to the degree that the capacity to love is also present. Shame does not deny its expression to love. It denies its expression to the sexual drive until it becomes confirmed love. Insofar as a man loves, he must affirm the modesty of his beloved. He cannot do otherwise. It is only the expression of his love and the increasing response to his own love that can make shame give way in a rightful manner. Although shame is an excitation in its double qualities of being a token for still undecided love and for something beautiful, anticipating still more than visible beauty. It excites only the love of the lover through the value of beauty. We'll pick that up again when we get to modesty at the end. So the question is, how does it do all this? What is this relationship between shame and love, and how does shame help to realize love? Scheler breaks this down into 3 accomplishments. I don't know what the word is in German. It sounds a little silly in English. 3 accomplishments of the feeling of sexual shame. And I'm paraphrasing the titles here to make them make more sense. So the primary accomplishment, he says, is that shame in the first place makes sex even possible. So shame makes sex possible. That sounds odd at first, right? But what Scheler says here is that the sex drive even is a development. It begins first with what he calls the libidinous sex drive. That is the attraction to voluptuous pleasure feelings. Those are his words, not mine. Yeah, voluptuous pleasure feelings. It's one word, of course, in German. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. Around the sexual organs, this is not yet the sex drive because it is not yet directed toward the other, right? It's just directed towards these feelings. He says, because of bodily shame, people have a natural shame reaction which cannot be reduced to fear for punishment. Fear of punishment or getting caught or something like this, to the titillations, again, his word, not mine, of the sex organ, right? So you have this natural desire for voluptuous pleasure feeling and the titillation of sexual organs, but you feel naturally ashamed of this, right? And I think a lot of people will say, oh, it's because you're afraid of being caught or something, but you find that this is not the case. People naturally respond in this way, that there's a sort of disgust, he would even say, with using your own body in this way. So he says, without this early shame reaction, right, that keeps us from these titillations, we would remain completely autoerotic, and our psychic energy would be completely used for individual sensory sensation. Interesting point. So if that seems mistaken, I invite you just to think of the massive epidemic of autoeroticism that is, currently afflicting our culture with widely available free pornography and the sort of stunted adolescence that's resulted from this, right? That you have people, and you see, you hear Franciscan lectures on this stuff all the time about the way that this rewires people's brains so that they don't actually even desire the other, and they don't desire. They have no real sex drive. They just have this sort of autoerotic drive for this sensation. So that would be a manifestation of shamelessness. And so shame ought to, when we have it, keep us from that. And so it is shame that frees us from this constant and restless drive of sexual feelings, and in so doing liberates us to direct our attention to the other in sexual sympathy, which comes with the expectation, or not with the expectation, of immediate satisfaction, but as an excitement and anticipation of shared joy. Right? So this idea of sympathy with another, that it's not just your own satisfaction, but a joy that you would share. So that's the first accomplishment of sexual shame, right? Is that it sort of frees us, right? So this is the language that uses, again, very different than how we normally think of shame as this oppressive thing. Shame frees us even to desire another person in the first place. The second accomplishment, he says, he calls shame the conscious of love. The law of shame makes one feel guilty at enthrallments to the stirrings of the sex drive that are devoid of love, even in marriage, he will say. So just the sort of base sex drive is something that we end up feeling guilty for. Shame is, this is a lovely quote, shame is the magnificent factor which institutes the unity of all sexual drivings, of the sexual and procreative drives and all higher and the highest functions of human spirit. Shame is that which fills, as it were, the immense emptiness that yawns between spirit and the senses. It is as if shame had bestowed upon it from spirit its highness and seriousness, from the senses its grace and its inviting beauty which entices love. It's the sexual drive. So the sexual drive on the there's a drive for procreation, right, and a sexual drive, both of which are only capable of reproducing themselves, right? The sex drive makes more sex. The procreative drive on its own would procreate, right? But
But both of those, when they are directed by shame, create the new and higher value, which is love, which is married love between a man and a woman, right? Which is a higher reality than any of these sort of drives on their own would produce. And it's shame that is the regulating principle there. So shame protects the individual from general use. It motivates us to be patient and prudent in our choice for a spouse and sexual partner, such that we select not for quantity, but for quality, not in expectation of sensual satisfaction, but in response to values. So the sexual drive on its own would seek merely to maximize pleasure, but it's the sexual drive guided by shame that looks for value. The feeling of shame curbs the expression and the effects of the drives of sex and procreation as long as sexual love has not yet completed the decisive role of selection. Shame is, as it were, a chrysalis. Sexual love grows within it until it breaks free. One effect of this is putting off sexual activity until later in life, preferably marriage. Scheler isn't as clear on the marriage part as Wettiwa is, but in any case, maturity and selection. So that's the second part. Shame is this consciousness that directs love and directs these drives. The third accomplishment is shame in sexual intercourse. Scheler enumerates 5 different ways that shame, the roles that shame has in sexual intercourse. We're only going to talk about the first one here, which is the most important one. He says that shame prevents intercourse on behalf of a purpose. That will be any purpose. Intercourse should not function as an action or movement of a purpose, but should be a movement of expression of love, uniting two individuals. People ask whether intercourse should serve the purpose of pleasure or procreation. Those people might be us. I think we've asked things like that this week. Scheler says, clearly talking about us, these venerable discussants do not seem to realize that this very alternative is a severe violation of shame. It is not a particular purpose, but the implicit purposefulness of the action involved that is contrary to shame. So he says that any sex that is for any purpose, other than as an expression of love, is already has a purpose and is then a sort of use, that you've reduced it to something inferior. So these are the 3 accomplishments of shame and how you see that shame directs and guides, makes possible even sexual love. We have to talk also, no discussion of shame would be complete without talking about, as you mentioned, being ashamed, this sort of negative feeling of shame. So he also talks about what he calls repenting shame or a burning shame. That is, I think, how most of us have probably first come to even know the word shame. I know for me, it was my grandmother. She would always say, shame, 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 shame on you. I don't know what this meant. I don't know if anyone else's grandmother did that, but that's what my grandmother always did to me. It felt terrible. It was a burning shame. And I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I do now. And so this sort of repenting or burning shame is when we look back and we look at a state of affairs that just doesn't live up to what it should have, right? And where we feel, in retrospect, this burning shame. He calls it even an organic revolt. Our whole body, our whole organism revolts against what has happened but even still here, right? So this seems negative, right? But even still here, it's not that we're just feeling bad. It's a revolt it's a recognition of the positive value that could have and should have been that has failed to actualize, right? That we have failed to actualize. And so we can be ashamed of a lie, we can be ashamed of a cowardly action, right? Not just because of that thing was bad, but because we see what we could have and should have done in that situation. In the sexual sphere, right, we can be ashamed that we gave ourselves in an undignified way or where love was not present, right? So those are some of the examples he uses. We can even look back and be ashamed that we weren't ashamed, right? And I think if we all examine our own consciences, we'll probably find that there are plenty of instances in which we are ashamed of our own shamelessness. So that's Scheler, briefly. There's a lot more to it, but we've kind of focused on the stuff that leads into Wettiwa.
So you can see, I think, why this was such, having read the section from Wettiwa, you can see why this was so influential. And a lot of what Wettiwa says is coming from this. Draws on it, but also develops it. So I would say the first thing that Wettiwa does is he aligns all of this with the personalistic norm. And so to review, in case we don't all have it memorized or written in front of us, this norm, so this is from Wettiwa, right? This norm in its negative aspect states that the person is the kind of good which does not admit of use and cannot be treated as an object of use, and as such, the means to an end. In its positive form, the personalistic norm confirms this: the person is a good towards which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. So because shame is a natural reaction that tends to conceal and protect the values of a person, Wettiwa sees it as a reflection of the essential nature of the person and a revelation of the supra-utilitarian character of the person. Okay? So this fits with the personalist norm that we cannot be used. Shame is one of the things that keeps us from being used, and it's natural, right? This is not, it's something you can cultivate, but it's not something that you need to be taught, right? It's a natural reaction. Man naturally revolts against being used even in a bodily way, right? Because we've talked about the unity of our person and soul and body here. So it is for this reason that shame, he says, becomes the metaphysical starting point for sexual ethics, because shame reveals this interiority and the super-utilitarian character of man. So much less than just sort of or much more than sort of a thing that you tack on, like, oh, we need to talk about shame too. Like, shame is right at the heart of the sexual ethics of Wettiwa. So sexual shame directly and immediately concerns sexual acts and organs, but the real object is the substance and secret. The substance and secret of shame is the person. This is not, and this is very useful and important in Wettiwa, this is not some abstract idea. It's not a proof or deduction or assertion that is available only to the intellect, but the feeling of shame is live and concrete, he says, and reveals the nature and value of the person precisely in this very bodily way. And so it's immediately available to us in our experience. With shame comes a great reverence and a great reservedness, a feeling that he or she, the object of one's desire or love, is too pure even to touch or to think of in a sexual way. This fear of contact, he calls it, is a way of affirming the value of the person as such, as opposed to the person insofar as they could be an object of use. When man and woman then do come together in mutual love and marriage, they do so instinctively in a private way, revealing and sharing their secret only with each other, not with the outside world, while concealing and protecting it from public view. I think it's interesting and worth noting that even in a culture that has a really negative view of shame, which openly accepts pornography, casual sex, hookup culture, people still do these things in private, which is an odd thing, really. I mean, if people sort of really put their money where their mouth is on their views of sexual desire and it's just being so perfectly natural, like they eat in public, but luckily they go behind closed doors for these shameless actions. So I mean, even people who disagree still kind of know. In marital love, the concealing and protecting function of shame has been served, right? We've made the choice. We have an affirmation in love, and man and woman now give themselves to each other. This Wettiwa calls the absorption of shame by love. It is interesting and noteworthy that he calls it an absorption, right? It's not a canceling out or a nullifying. So it doesn't just go away. It is taken up in love. We'll need to talk about that a little more. Affirmation of the value of the person. So in marriage, he says, affirmation of the value of the person so thoroughly permeates all the sensual and emotional reactions connected with sexual values that the will is not threatened by a utilitarian outlook incompatible with the proper attitude of a person. This affirmation, it is important to note, is not a mere feeling, but an affirmation of the will. It's not an emotional affirmation. It can appear that shame is absorbed in intense desire, strong romantic feeling, moments of passion, but these emotional experiences often have only a subjective character, whereas real love between persons possesses a clear purpose, desiring the good for another, right, which is something that is willed.
So the question then becomes, what is the role of shame in marriage? And we talked a little bit about this the other day. Wojtyła doesn't say too much about it. Scheler is actually a little bit more explicit. Scheler says that that shame still has a role to play in marriage. He says, first, the partners are still shameful in regard to people outside of the marriage, right? The husband would still act with shame towards any other woman who is not his wife. But even within the marriage, shame will still protect us from base sexual desires, from tendencies towards use and objectification. We know that these things are still still very possible in marriage. And so even though shame isn't sort of active, the potency for it remains and still has a very important place in marriage, both towards the outside world and potentially, though hopefully not, towards our own spouses. But it also shows that certain things are appropriate and not appropriate within marriage. And certain sexual acts are appropriate and inappropriate within marriage because they're shameful or not. And we've talked about this some in some of our small groups, and I won't get into it too much here other than to say an odd story from near my hometown in Texas. There's an evangelical, one of these mega churches with all the different satellites, like McDonald's, and the pastor there, they were doing a big thing on sex and how good sex is, right? Sex positivity. I mean, kind of good stuff in a way, but the way that they were showing this was the pastor and his wife were going to spend like a whole day or a week like in bed on top of the church and conduct interviews and invite people in to talk about their sex life. And you're like, okay, you're kind of right, but this is shameless, right? And what you see, and this is not uncommon, I think, is you see this idea that shame is supposed to protect us until marriage, but once you're married, whatever you want, man, that's fine. And I think that's not an uncommon idea, and it's an idea that gets abused a lot. So it's very important, I think, to understand the role of shame, both leading to marriage, but also in marriage, and not to spend a week in bed with your wife on the roof of a church, if at all possible. So that's a nice segue into shamelessness. Which we should talk about next. Having established what shame is, what is shamelessness? So shamelessness, of course, is lacking these sorts of things we've been talking about now. And in the most obvious sense, right, you have a bodily shamelessness, which will manifest itself in sensuality and carnality, right? In a Don Juan, a Lothario, all this. One thing I thought was also really interesting here that was certainly very new to me when I read it is this idea of emotional shamelessness as well, which he says consists in the rejection of the healthy tendency to be ashamed of reactions and feelings which make another person merely an object of use because of the sexual values belonging to them. A man who's bodily shameless will be a sensualist. That's a relatively common trope, obvious, sort of easy to say, easy to see, easy to blame. But emotional shamelessness is more subtle. It's harder to detect. Perhaps it's even far more common. To look at a woman with lust in her eyes is adultery, right? We know this. And to not guard against thoughts and feelings of sexual and emotional use, even if they would never result in bodily action, is emotional shamelessness. It's an interior as opposed to an exterior act, but it's no less shameful on account of it. So even when I think you read that line from Matthew about lust in the eyes, right, you're still thinking usually of a bodily use. One of the subtleties that Wojtyła picks up on here is that we can use people emotionally also, right? And that our shame should guard not only against physical actions or even physical desires, but the sort of emotional satisfaction that comes from love or courtship, dating, all of these things that might seem harmless because they have no sort of physical counterpart. But he notes that there's an emotional shamelessness there as well that we need to guard against because you're still using the person. So following from shamelessness, we should look at then, how is shame actually manifest? And it is manifest in modesty. Modesty is sort of the expression of shame. Shame protects the inviolable value of the person, and modesty, as the expression of shame, this is interesting, reveals the value, right? So shame protects the value, modesty reveals the value, but it reveals it, paradoxically, by concealing, right? Modesty shows the value of the person by revealing that there is something still concealed, and it creates this depth, this anticipation, this distance even, where you see, you know that you don't know. So shame, this is from Scheler, shame observed renders to one who sees it a feeling of a depth of value which is never given directly and is of a value dimension different from the visible values. In this depth of valueness, an infinity of other treasures of value which gleam magically through continue to be dormant, right? So you see this gleaming of the value of the person manifest in modesty, but you don't see what it is. Shame or modesty is beautiful because it is the promise of beauty. It is a way of promising, its way of promising is beautiful because the promise is not willed. Indeed, in hiding beauty, shame reveals its secret existence. Wittiwa says that modesty is the constant capacity and readiness to feel shame. It is a constant eagerness to avoid what is shameful. But he goes on to say that sexual modesty, as it is, as it were, a defensive reflex which protects the status and so protects the value of the person. But there's more to it than that. It is a matter not just of protecting, but of revealing the value of the person, and of doing so in the context of the sexual values which are simultaneously present in a particular person. So what then is immodesty? So modesty is this protecting and revealing, right? What then is immodesty? There's no clear rule that either of them give, like we're like, how long does your skirt need to be, and do your shoulders need to be covered? And then Wittiwa, no answer, if that's what you're looking for. And both Scheler and Wittiwa note that these things vary in different cultures. But what always marks immodesty, in dress or behavior, is that it draws attention to the sexual drive as opposed to love, right? So we talked about this also last night in the discussion on art and pornography. When pornography, or when art, draws attention only or predominantly to the sexual values as opposed to love, it becomes pornography, and likewise dress or behavior would in a similar fashion become immodest. Naturally, this will be somewhat relative. This does change in different cultures, different times. I mean, it's a different thing if you're in the South or in the North. It's much hotter in the South. So there are always but there are two particular forms of immodesty that we should talk about. One is prudishness, and the other is coquetry. We would probably call that flirtatiousness today, but then I wouldn't get to say coquetry. I'm gonna take this time to do that as much as we can. So the shameful, this is mostly from Scheler on this part. The shameful and the coquettish person says they behave in similar ways, looking bashful, withdrawing, looking down, sort of being reserved. But coquetry does not awaken love. It only excites the drive. It does not protect. So it's a way of faking shame and faking modesty. When it pretends to modesty, it becomes seduction and morally blamable. For seduction is not simply a willed sexual excitation of the other, but one of pretending love and values which are not present. Coquetry is never turned inward. When it looks away, it is always with the intent to look back again. Right? Prudishness is a similar thing in that it pretends to shame. Right? What prudishness will often do, he notes, is take on expressions of shame from past cultures, past times that are no longer really living expressions of shame, and adopt them for its own. But as a form of expression of shame, it's empty of a feeling of shame, and it has ceased to correspond to the tendencies of the living shame expressions. Wittiwa says that prudery consists in concealing one's real intentions with regard to persons of the other sex, or with regard to sexual matters in general. It is linked, he says, with shameless intentions. I don't know if this gives a whole lot of, real prescriptions, and don't like, you know, go home and start judging all your friends about like whether who's prudish, who's coquettish. But I mean, they're interesting distinctions to help us sort through ways that people might appear modest, and certainly I think in our own behavior, you know, it's not really, you know, with something like modesty, it's not really enough to fake it till you make it, right? Like if you're trying to act modest, but in fact not being modest, you will cause problems for yourself and others. And so I see we're kind of nearing the end, so I want to wrap up with some of the takeaways that I thought were surprising, at least when I had first read this, and I think would be surprising still to most people in our culture. So shame is internal. It is not imposed from without, right? It's something that wells up in us. Both Scheler and Wettiwa use this language of welling all the time. Shame wells up. And shame is something internal to us, it's natural. It is something that we can learn and cultivate, but it is not that it is only learned and cultivated, right? It is a natural response that all people have. Scheler remarks of a ethnologist. He says, if you were to find no signs of shame in a culture, I would just tell you to go look again. You missed it. Like it's that you don't know what you're looking for. So it's internal, it's natural, it's universal. All people have it in some or all cultures have it in some form or fashion. Shame is oriented not towards the negative values, not towards bad feelings. Shame is is oriented towards and protects higher values. It protects higher from lower values. It protects private from public. Shame is necessary in the development of love. It's not just a feature that's sometimes present. It is an essential feature in the development of love between two people. And when that love is confirmed, ratified, sanctified in marriage, that love is absorbed, or that shame is absorbed into the marriage. And that modesty is an expression of shame, which does not conceal but reveals that something is concealed. So that is the way that shame is manifest to most of us.